This is Chapter 34 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 11 of Volume 2. In the previous chapter, Colonel Fitzwilliam unwittingly tells Elizabeth that it was Mr. Darcy who separated Jane and Bingley. He said that there were objections to the lady. Elizabeth infers that these objections were just her family's status and rank, and she is furious with Mr. Darcy and does not go to Rosings so that she can avoid seeing him that evening. When they were gone, Elizabeth, as if intending to exasperate herself as much as possible against Mr. Darcy, chose for her employment the examination of all the letters which Jane had written to her since her being in Kent. They contained no actual complaint, nor was there any revival of past occurrences or any communication of present suffering, but in all, and in almost every line of each, there was a want of that cheerfulness which had been used to characterize her style, and which, proceeding from the serenity of a mind at ease with itself, and kindly disposed towards everyone, had been scarcely ever clouded. Elizabeth noticed every sentence conveying the idea of uneasiness, with an attention which it had hardly received on the first perusal. Mr. Darcy's shameful boast of what misery he had been able to inflict gave her a keener sense of her sister's sufferings. It was some consolation to think that his visit to Rosings was to end on the day after the next, and a still greater, that in less than a fortnight she should herself be with Jane again, and enabled to contribute to the recovery of her spirits by all that affection could do. So she rereads Jane's letters, and she realizes that although Jane never brings up Mr. Bingley, never complains about anything going on, that she just lacks her usual cheerfulness, and that's devastating for Elizabeth because Jane is so kind and happy. It's really apparent that she's been hurt. And she thinks of Mr. Darcy boasting about the fact that he saved Bingley, and it just really makes her more and more angry. She could not think of Darcy's leaving Kent without remembering that his cousin was to go with him, but Colonel Fitzwilliam had made it clear that he had no intentions at all, and, agreeable as he was, she did not mean to be unhappy about him. So by intentions, Jane Austen means intentions to marry, so Colonel Fitzwilliam made it clear that he doesn't have any intentions to ask Elizabeth to marry him, so Elizabeth is fine with that. While settling this point, she was suddenly roused by the sound of the doorbell, and her spirits were a little flustered by the idea of its being Colonel Fitzwilliam himself, who had once before called late in the evening, and might now come to inquire particularly after her. But this idea was soon banished, and her spirits were very differently affected when, to her utter amazement, she saw Mr. Darcy walk into the room. In a hurried manner, he immediately began an inquiry after her health, imputing his visit to a wish of hearing that she were better. She answered him with cold civility. He sat down for a few moments, and then getting up, walked about the room. Elizabeth was surprised, but said not a word. After a silence of several minutes, he came towards her in an agitated manner, and thus began. In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Elizabeth's astonishment was beyond expression. She stared, colored, doubted, and was silent. This he considered sufficient encouragement, and the avowal of all that he felt and had long felt for her immediately followed. He spoke well, but there were feelings besides those of the heart to be detailed, and he was not more eloquent on the subject of tenderness than of pride. His sense of her inferiority, of its being a degradation, of the family obstacles which judgment had always opposed to inclination, were dwelt on with a warmth which seemed due to the consequence he was wounding, but was very unlikely to recommend his suit. So Mr. Darcy tells Elizabeth that he loves her, and then says that he has long admired her, but he also talks about how she's inferior, less than him, that marrying her would be degrading for him, that family obstacles would make people judge him for marrying her, and saying that this is a big deal for me to be asking, telling you that I love you. In spite of her deeply rooted dislike, she could not be insensible to the compliment of such a man's affection, and though her attentions did not vary for an instant, she was at first sorry for the pain he was to receive, till, roused to resentment by his subsequent language, she lost all compassion and anger. So at first, even though Elizabeth does not like him, she feels bad because he is an important person and it's going to hurt him for her to say no to him. He is asking her to marry him. But then she remembers, she thinks of his language after that about how this would be a step down for him and gets angry. She tried, however, to compose herself to answer him with patience when he should have done. He concluded with representing to her the strength of that attachment which, in spite of all his endeavors, he had found impossible to conquer, and with expressing his hope that it would now be rewarded by her acceptance of his hand. As he said this, she could easily see that he had no doubt of a favorable answer. He spoke of apprehension and anxiety, but his countenance expressed real security. Such a circumstance could only exasperate farther, and when he ceased, the color rose into her cheeks, and she said, so Mr. Darcy says that he's nervous and anxious, but he doesn't look it, and that makes her really angry, because who is he to think that she would say yes when she has many reasons to say no? And when he ceased, the color rose into her cheeks, and she said, in such cases as this, it is, I believe, the established mode to express a sense of obligation for the sentiments avowed, however unequally they may be returned. It is natural that obligation should be felt, and if I could feel gratitude, I would now thank you. But I cannot. I have never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. I am sorry to have occasioned pain to anyone. It has been most unconsciously done, however, and I hope will be of short duration. The feelings which you tell me have long prevented the acknowledgement of your regard can have little difficulty in overcoming it after this explanation. So Elizabeth said, you gave me all these reasons why you shouldn't marry me and love me, so hopefully that will help you get over me saying no. Although she does say, I should feel grateful, but I don't. Mr. Darcy, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his eyes fixed on her face, seemed to catch her words with no less resentment than surprise. His complexion became pale with anger, and the disturbance of his mind was visible in every feature. He was struggling for the appearance of composure, and would not open his lips till he believed himself to have attained it. The pause was to Elizabeth's feelings dreadful. At length, in a voice of forced calmness, he said, and this is all the reply which I am to have the honor of expecting. I might, perhaps, wish to be informed why, with so little endeavor at civility, I am thus rejected, but it is of small importance. I might as well inquire, replied she, why with so evident a design of offending and insulting me you chose to tell me that you liked me against your will, against your reason, and even against your character. Was not this some excuse for incivility if I was uncivil? But I have other provocations. You know I have. Had not my own feelings decided against you, had they been indifferent, or had they even been favorable, do you think that any consideration would tempt me to accept the man who has been the means of ruining, perhaps forever, the happiness of a most beloved sister? All right, so Mr. Darcy listens to all of that. He's surprised, but he also is angry, and says, I would like to know why I'm rejected, but I really don't care. And then Elizabeth said, why would you tell me that you loved me, even though you had to insult and offend me, and you did this against your reason, so against judgment and logic, against your character and against your will, so you didn't want to do this. And then she also mentions, you ruined Jane's happiness. That's another reason, aside from the fact that I don't like you, that I would say no. As she pronounced these words, Mr. Darcy changed color, but the emotion was short, and he listened without attempting to interrupt her while she continued. I have every reason in the world to think ill of you. No motive can excuse the unjust and ungenerous part you acted there. You dare not, you cannot deny that you have been the principal, if not the only means of dividing them from each other, of exposing one to the center of the world for caprice and instability. So she's talking about Mr. Bingley, so the world will censure or criticize and judge him for being, capricious, following his whims, and not being stable and constant to Jane. The other to its derision for disappointed hopes, and involving them both in misery of the acutest kind. Derision would be Jane, who would be mocked for having disappointed hopes. So Elizabeth saying you set both of them up for judgment. She paused and saw with no slight indignation that he was listening with an air which proved him wholly unmoved by any feeling of remorse. He even looked at her with a smile of affected incredulity. So he does not feel sorry, and he's shocked that she's saying all this. Can you deny that you have done it? She repeated. With assumed tranquility, he then replied, I have no wish of denying that I did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister, or that I rejoice in my success. Towards him I have been kinder than towards myself. Just note your little dialogue tag. So Mr. Darcy says this with assumed tranquility, so he's pretending to be calm, but he is not. By that last line, he says, he says that he's glad he separated Jane and Bingley, but that last sentence is important. Towards him, I have been kinder than towards myself. So he says, I've been kinder towards Bingley. I've stopped him from marrying someone beneath him, but not towards myself. He's saying that he's proposing to Elizabeth and has lowered himself. Elizabeth disdained the appearance of noticing this civil reflection, but its meaning did not escape, nor was it likely to conciliate her. But it is not merely this affair, she continued, on which my dislike is founded. Long before it had taken place, my opinion of you was decided. Your character was unfolded in the recital which I received many months ago from Mr. Wickham. On this subject, what can you have to say? In what imaginary act of friendship can you here defend yourself, or under what misrepresentation can you here impose upon others? You take an eager interest in that gentleman's concern, said Darcy, in a less tranquil tone and with a heightened color. By that he's probably suggesting that he realized she was interested in Wickham. Who that knows what his misfortunes have been can help feeling an interest in him? His misfortunes, repeated Darcy contemptuously. Yes, his misfortunes have been great indeed. And of your infliction, cried Elizabeth with energy, you have reduced him to his present state of poverty, comparative poverty. You have withheld the advantages which you must know to have been designed for him. You have deprived the best years of his life of that independence which was no less his due than his desert. You have done all this, and yet you can treat the mention of his misfortunes with contempt and ridicule. So Elizabeth says, you took away his chance for happiness and success and financial stability, and you are, talking poorly about him. You're making fun of his ridicule. You're making fun of his unhappiness and his pain. And this, cried Darcy, as he walked with quick steps across the room, is your opinion of me. This is the estimation in which you hold me. I thank you for explaining it so fully. My faults, according to this calculation, are heavy indeed. But perhaps, added he, stopping in his walk and turning towards her, these offences might have been overlooked, had not your pride been hurt by my honest confession of the scruples that had long prevented my forming any serious design. These bitter accusations might have been suppressed had I, with greater policy, concealed my struggles and flattered you into the belief of my being impelled by unqualified, unalloyed inclination, by reason, by reflection, by everything. But disguise of every sort is my abhorrence, nor am I ashamed of the feelings I related. They were natural and just. Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections? To congratulate myself on the hope of relations whose condition in life is so decidedly beneath my own? So Mr. Darcy says, I was being honest with you when I said all of these things. Did you want me to pretend that everything was perfect? And maybe you wouldn't have said all of these things about me if I hadn't hurt your pride and mentioned the reservations and concerns I have about marrying you. Elizabeth felt herself growing more angry every moment, yet she tried to the utmost to speak with composure when she said, You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me in any other way than as it spared me the concern which I might have felt in refusing you, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. So Elizabeth says, by acting like such a jerk as you're proposing, I just don't feel guilty for you. I still would have said no matter how you asked me. She saw him start at this, but he said nothing, and she continued. You could not have made me the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. Again his astonishment was obvious, and he looked at her with an expression of mingled incredulity and mortification. She went on, From the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners, impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, were such as to form that groundwork of disapprobation on which succeeding events have built so immovable a dislike. And I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry. So she says, no, I hated you from the first moment I saw you, from the very beginning. Your rudeness and obnoxiousness made you the last person I ever would have married. You have said quite enough, madam. I perfectly comprehend your feelings, and have now only to be ashamed of what my own have been. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness. I think that's like the greatest thing that he says. I'm ashamed of my feelings, and then, but also, accept my best wishes for your health and happiness. So he's really like furious, but he still has to say, best wishes for your health and happiness. So polite. At least in that last thing he said. Everything else before that, not so polite. And with these words, he hastily left the room, and Elizabeth heard him the next moment open the front door and quit the house. The tumult of her mind was now painfully great. She knew not how to support herself, and, from actual weakness, sat down and cried for half an hour. Her astonishment, as she reflected on what had passed, was increased by every review of it, that she should receive an offer of marriage from Mr. Darcy, that he should have been in love with her for so many months, so much in love as to wish to marry her in spite of all the objections which had made him prevent his friends marrying her sister, and which must appear at least with equal force in his own case, was almost incredible. It was gratifying to have inspired unconsciously so strong an affection, but his pride, his abominable pride, his shameless avowal of what he had done with respect to Jane, his unpardonable assurance in acknowledging it, though he could not justify it, and the unfeeling manner in which he had mentioned Mr. Wickham, his cruelty towards whom he had not attempted to deny, soon overcame the pity which the consideration of his attachment had for a moment excited. She continued in very agitating reflections till the sound of Lady Catherine's carriage made her feel how unequal she was to encounter Charlotte's observation, and hurried her away to her room. That last paragraph is interesting because after all of this drama and Elizabeth really giving Mr. Darcy a piece of her mind, she has sort of a mix of emotions. The tumult of her mind was now great, so she's going through mixed emotions, and they're also, I always think of tumult as like a boat on a wave, so things are kind of going up and down. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unease and disquiet. So she cries for 30 minutes, which is a pretty long time to be crying. She's astonished. She's astonished, she's shocked. It's sort of flattering to her that he still asked her to marry him, even though he had all of these objections and problems. And the same objections and problems made him stop Mr. Bingley from being with Jane. It's kind of flattering that without even realizing it, she made someone fall in love with her. But he's incredibly proud. He owns up to separating Bingley and Jane, which is unforgivable, and his cruelty towards Mr. Wickham and just totally ruining Wickham's life and future. All of these things get rid of whatever pity she felt for Mr. Darcy. She hears the carriage come home, the carriage that is taking Charlotte and Mr. Collins, and she just can't think of how she would react to Charlotte talking to her. Charlotte knows her pretty well, and it seems like she is visibly upset, so Charlotte would know that something was certainly off, so she leaves and she exits the scene. So that is the very dramatic chapter 34 of Pride and Prejudice.